Good morning. My name's Don Cooke. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I spent 33 years working as an American diplomat, working in embassies overseas and in the State Department in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you all to the 2021-2022 United Nations Conference and give a special shout out to the faculty and staff who've worked so hard to organize this, and a special greeting to all of the students who are here who are going to make this possible, and I hope learn something about the United Nations, about international diplomacy. And I want to say that my own journey into the U.S. Foreign Service and my work as a diplomat started in a conference very much like the one you're sitting in now. I was a member of the Junior Council on World Affairs at St. Joseph High School in Cleveland, Ohio, and they participated in Model United Nations at Gannon College in Erie, Pennsylvania, at Cuyahoga Community College in Cleveland, Ohio, and the big conference, the national one, the North American Invitational Model United Nations at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And it was a lot of fun doing it, and I met some great guys there in the club, and I also enjoyed the Model United Nations. In fact, the faculty advisor at one point pulled me aside. He said that you seem to be pretty good at this, and he suggested that I take the Foreign Service Officer's exam and apply to become a Foreign Service Officer with the Department of State. And I did that quite a number of years later. What was ironic at the Model United Nations in Cleveland was it was the students who ran part of it, and I was the chairman of the Committee on Terrorism, and we were trying to define terrorism and to come up with international solutions to try to prevent and control it. All the more ironic since my first assignment overseas was at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And Tehran was going through difficult times. The religious authorities, the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers, had just overthrown the Shah of Iran and taken control of the country. And they were very suspicious of the United States, since the United States and the U.S. government had been very friendly with the Shah. And one thing that they were adamant about was they did not want the United States to provide refuge for the Shah, partially because they thought if the Shah went to the United States, he would begin plotting to overthrow the Islamic government and return to Iran. And so it was 3.5 months after I arrived there. The Shah was in Cairo, and it was determined that he was quite ill, and his supporters in the United States convinced the Carter administration to allow him to come to the U.S. for cancer treatment. After that, we started seeing daily demonstrations outside of the embassy, which were becoming increasingly hostile. On November 4, 1979, a group of young people who claimed they'd be associated with Tehran University stormed the gates, came over the walls, and eventually took 80-some people prisoner. And after releasing the Iranian nationals there and some of the American embassy people, the African Americans and the women, they kept 42 of us for 444 days as prisoners. For the first half of that time, so that's almost a little over a year, 14.5 months, for the first half of that time we were held in various places. Part of the time we were being held inside the embassy grounds. The embassy in Tehran was quite large. It covered an entire city block and had the Chancery building, a consulate building, residences for the ambassador and the deputy chief of mission, housing for the Marine security guards, and a warehouse, actually. Then, after the rescue attempt in April of 1980, they moved us to various parts around the country. I stayed with one other hostage, a Marine by the name of Kevin Hermaning, in a military base in what looked like officers' housing or something like that. But they had blocked all the windows and they kept us isolated in one room. And that lasted until roughly July, when we were moved back to Tehran and spent pretty much the rest of our time there in an actual prison, in Comité prison. The treatment we got was, well, the big suffering was actually being separated from your family and being held prisoner. And so the treatment in terms of where you were being held and how you were being fed and what communication you had with your family was secondary to the fact that you're not free, that someone comes in and tells you what you're going to do all day and you're not allowed to leave the room. And the other thing that was hard was that they would not tell us any information about what our situation was, whether there were negotiations on to getting us free or anything like that. They didn't want to give us any idea of how well or how poorly the negotiations for our release were going. And so that was hard. The one thing they did tell us was they told us that the hostage crisis was a big deal in the United States, that Americans were outraged by this and were very vocal about how they felt about the hostage situation and their desire to see us released. And we were skeptical, to say the least. We really didn't think that a couple of dozen embassy people in a faraway land being held prisoners was going to motivate the United States and the American people at all. And we found out, much to our surprise, that the Iranians were in fact telling us the truth. We got to the hospital in Wiesbaden after being freed, a U.S. Air Force military hospital in Germany, and we could see just from videotapes that they'd done of the news programs and demonstrations and a campaign of yellow ribbons after the Tie a Yellow Ribbon song and the song about how a young lady wore a yellow ribbon in her hair for her boyfriend who'd gone off to serve in the Civil War. And even more surprising, I think, when we came back to the United States, we spent a week at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in the Thayer Hotel there. We flew into a very small Air Force base, Stewart Air Base, which was maybe 20 minutes away from West Point, and we were in buses going from the airport to the hotel, and all along the side of the road in January, in the dead of winter, in New York forest, were people who were lining the roads with signs, welcome home hostages, waving yellow ribbons and American flags, and we were impressed. We were very surprised. It brings tears to my eyes even to this day to remember the outpouring of support and warmth from the American people. As far as being a hostage goes, I think I had a pretty good grip on what was happening, and I was always fairly confident that we were going to be released unharmed. There were some of my colleagues that weren't quite as sure, and so it was a little harder for them to cope with it. Also, you would think that under those circumstances, the main emotion you would feel would be fear, but the reality is for the most of the time it was just boring. You're just locked in a room. Maybe you have a stack of books to read. Maybe you're with somebody who you like and you can tell stories to each other or make jokes or play cards. But for the most part of it, it was boring. Now, mind you, the parts that were scary, they were pretty scary. And so most of us, as I say, got along. I was talking to one of the advisors when we were at the hospital in Wiesbaden who said, you seem to have coped with it fairly well. How do you think, why do you think that was possible? And I told him that I was young, I was single, I didn't have anybody who was dependent on me back in the United States, and so I was pretty much a free agent and was there and didn't have to worry about my wife, my children, or anything like that. And he said, that sounds very reasonable, but now I want you to think about the couple of guys that you know who had a rough time. And to my surprise, thinking about it, they were in the same boat that I was. They were relatively young, single, weren't married, didn't have children. So I can't really say why it is one person copes better with a situation like this. In fact, in some of the people that you would have thought would have had a hard time, came through with flying colors. Other people who you would have thought were pretty tough had a rougher time with it. Some people asked why I was decided to stay with the State Department, and it was because I enjoyed the work. Absolutely. I once told my father that if I were independently wealthy, I would pay money to work as a Foreign Service officer. It requires a certain amount of flexibility. You're constantly on the move. You're also dealing with new situations and new cultures overseas, but I found the work very exciting, very interesting, engaging, and I wouldn't have traded my career at the Foreign Service with just about anything else. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up at this point. I always find that the best answers I give are when I'm asked questions from the people who are in the audience who are actually telling me what they want to hear about. And so I think we're going to open up now for questions, and I think that means we're going to go live. So let's start questions and answers. I'll be happy to answer your questions. And once again, welcome. Have a good time. Enjoy the Model United Nations and learn about what's going on, especially in crisis situations like now that we face with Russia and Ukraine. So let's go to questions and answers. Thank you.